Welcome to today's virtual town hall. We are the Color of Freedom, Resisting Police Surveillance in a Trump Era. My name is Stephen Renderos. I'm the organizing director here at the Center for Media Justice, and joining me from my wonderful partner organization, Color of Change, is Anika. Anika, could you introduce yourself really quickly?
Of course. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And as Stephen mentioned, my name is Anika, and I am a senior campaign manager at Color of Change. We are the nation's largest online racial justice organization, and we are so happy to partner with you all today. And I really look forward to what the next few moments have to bring.
Awesome. And we are your co-hosts for today's virtual town hall. In addition to an exciting conversation led by our amazing moderator and presenters, which we'll turn to in just a bit, we're also excited to be releasing a report today titled "We Are the Color of Freedom," basically the exact same name of the webinar. This report actually highlights reflections from a gathering that we hosted, Center for Media Justice hosted in partnership with Color of Change, Free Press, and the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. And it brought together a group of more than 60 organizers, activists, technologists, and lawyers. The topic was looking at the intersection of surveillance, racial profiling, policing, and communities of color. This report actually lifts up some of the recommendations and interventions that are needed to combat racist surveillance. You'll all be receiving a copy of this report following the conclusion of this webinar. Before we get started, I wanted to run through just a quick set of logistics. First, know that this webinar is being recorded. We had such a high volume of RSVPs, and many of those folks requested to receive a copy of this webinar since they could not be here with us. So just be aware that this webinar is in fact being recorded. Secondly, we'd love to create a parallel conversation on social media. So please tweet along with us. And we have some suggested accounts to be following if you want to check out some of what we're putting on social media right now, including the Center for Media Justice Twitter @MediaJustice, as well as the @ColorOfChange Twitter account. And anything that you post on social media, please use the hashtag surveillance. And then lastly, since we want this to be an interactive conversation, we do want to encourage you to ask questions, but to ask questions through the webinar platform itself. Many of you, now that you've opened up and joined this webinar, have a control panel either on your right hand or left hand side of your screen. If you look in that control panel, there is a section called questions. So please enter your questions there and submit your questions through the control panel, and we'll do our best throughout the life of this webinar to answer those questions. The other thing I wanted to just mention is this conversation comes at a very critical time. We are 60+ days into the Trump administration. At the time that we hosted this gathering in December, we were fresh a few weeks away from Trump being elected into office. And at that time, it was important to have this conversation of how surveillance is impacting communities of color, within the context of how this new administration would impact the conditions that our communities are facing on the ground. So with that said, one of the interesting kind of differences between that conversation and this one is we've seen what this administration has engaged in terms of its actions. So we want to get more granular, more specific in terms of the impacts that our communities are facing right now, and how this history of surveillance that has been happening in our communities is being impacted by the ideology and approach and policies of this new administration. Helping to guide us, moving us along into that conversation is our moderator, Brandon Patterson. He'll be moderating a roundtable conversation today. And just so you know a little bit about him, there's Brandon. Brandon is a reporter at Mother Jones out of their San Francisco bureau, and he covers issues of policing, criminal justice, as well as covering issues related to the movement for Black Lives and just the movement in general. He also writes about queer identity politics, and we're really excited to pass it off to him to lead us in this roundtable conversation. Hey, Brandon.
Thanks, guys. I will start us off with a poll that you at home should see on your screens and be able to respond to. The question is, What was your reaction the night Donald Trump was elected into office? And as our viewers do that, I'll introduce our esteemed guests. First, we have Mori Soundarajan. Mori is an activist, artist, and the executive director of Equality Labs, a digital security startup that centers women, gender nonconforming, and trans people of South Asian descent, as well as South Asian religious and cultural minorities. Mori has done great work teaching security and counter-surveillance techniques in Arab and Muslim communities. Next, we have Joan Donovan. Joan is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA, where she's currently researching the impact of DNA ancestry tests on the worldview of white nationalists. Joan has also studied the communication infrastructures of other social movements like Black Lives Matter. We also have with us Deborah Peterson Small. Deborah is the founder and director of Break the Chains, a public policy research and advocacy organization that focuses on the impact of punitive drug policies on poor communities of color. She also served as the legislative director for the New York Civil Liberties Union, where she lobbied the state legislature on behalf of those same communities. And last but not least, we have Alvaro Bedoya, the founding executive director of Georgetown Law School's Center on Privacy and Technology. He is an expert on digital privacy issues, including face recognition technology, commercial data collection, and government surveillance, with a special focus on their impact on communities of color, immigrants, and low-income communities. Thank you and welcome to all of our panelists.
Thank you for having us.
So let's get started. We'll start us off with our opening question, which was the same question asked of our viewers at home. In one sentence, what was your reaction the night Trump was elected? If we could start us off with Mori.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, I had a deep and overwhelming sense of dread. And I remember starting to pace in my apartment because I knew everything that we knew was going to change. And the possibilities of what it was meant for Muslim, South Asian, and Arab communities was completely going to be different. And we would not know what level of control we would have in being able to mitigate that damage. And it wasn't rational. It wasn't something where I started to put on my organizing logistical mind. All I felt was like blanket fear. And then after that, a deep and abiding anger at the people that allowed and were willing to throw our communities under the bus.
Yeah. Feel free to jump in where you may.
Hi, this is Deborah Small. So I actually had awakened 2 days before the election in the middle of the night with a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach and a sense that Trump had a good chance of winning. And I was at a convention at the time in San Diego, harm reduction conference, and I told my friends about waking up and about the feeling that I had. And they all told me that I was kind of crazy, that I was worried too much, that everything was going to be okay. And they convinced me to come to LA on election night for the planned Prop 64 victory party. So I did that, and that's where I actually was on the night that I found out that he had actually won the election. And in part, I was not surprised. And the quote unquote party felt more like a wake. And to me, that's kind of the space that America has been in ever since that night.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Joan. So I was in a bit of a different position for the last year. I've been studying, or more than the past year, but I've been studying the growing white nationalist movement online and their excitement around Trump. Of course, the research that we've been doing is about how white nationalists think about their claims to their genetic ancestry and European blood in a moment. And this was something that has been persistent across time with with white nationalists and their desire to claim ties to Europe. But on the message boards and places that we were looking for data over the last year,
I could tell that Trump was speaking to a different audience. And so in the 6 months leading up to the election, every time there was a new kind of meme that had surfaced around Trump related to words that he was using, these white nationalists, or these, I mean, they're some of the most disgusting racists. I go to the very dark corners of the web. They were really excited about it. And they also were talking a lot about not pushing it, not getting in the faces of your coworkers, keeping it quiet, letting it happen. And they were very sure that Trump was going to win. And I could see more and more people coming into those conversations, more and more people taking him seriously. And so on the night of the election, I was actually at the airport dropping my wife off, who was going to visit some family in Canada, and I was contemplating maybe I should get on this plane. And later that night, as I sat in my house alone in California, I said, this is the time to organize. This is the time to jump in and to really get serious about community organized action, and especially related to the surveillance state that had been built during the Obama administration. Check.
We're glad you're still here with us, John.
This is Alvaro, and like I think all the other folks here, well, except for Joan, who I think saw this coming in a way that a lot of folks might not have, I felt deep disappointment and disbelief, and it was like 3 a.m. on the East Coast, and I think even for despite all the time that I've spent working on immigrant rights and labor rights, and I still think I held on to certain ideas about, racists eventually lose, and misogynists, will be called out, and liars will be called out for their lies. And this was a pretty stunning rebuke to all those ideas. And I don't have any illusion that these things are, these are kind of myths that we hold on to, but to have that myth just trampled by this man was pretty brutal.
Yeah. Well, let's see what our viewers at home had to say with the results from our poll. What was your reaction the night Donald Trump was elected? We have almost a majority who said they cried. Got some anger. Not such unexpected results. A lot of people were deeply affected by Trump's election. But with that, we can move on to our first question for you panelists. These are scary times we're living in. When it comes to security and surveillance, what are some of the most dangerous narratives being pushed in our politics right now? And some of the technological tools that are threatening communities of color. Maury, we can start off with you.
Well, I think what is really startling to me, and I think that, this was really emphasized again and again in the summit that we had all participated in, is that there is this very deadly process of normalizing surveillance and normalizing the erosion of our right to privacy, just as we see a very dangerous collusion between corporate platforms and the state to directly go after individual and organizations that are organizing around questions of racial justice. And I think, in the work that we do at Equality Labs, we do community digital self-defense that centers trauma and centers self-care in the wake of, the rise of the surveillance state. And I think one of the things that I just cannot grapple with is that it was under Obama that we saw the proliferation of the surveillance state, and we now see that in the hands of a rapist, racist, white supremacist state with someone who is inherently mentally unstable. That to me is we're not in like code orange or code yellow, we are in code red. And if you are a community who is under the crosshairs of the state, if you're Black, brown, indigenous, or Muslim, or South Asian, or Arab, we're in a situation now where we must use circumvention technologies because the law is failing to protect our right to privacy. So some of the things that I'm most concerned about from a technological perspective is the collaboration between corporate platforms like Facebook and Google into projects like PRISM, where we have directly at the corporate site huge amounts of data going into NSA collection programs. I'm concerned about the attacks on our right to assembly when we have the use of stingrays and other surveillance apparatus that are meant to like dragnet and get mass SMS texts and phones from organizers. And I'm also deeply concerned about algorithmic discrimination and the way that we're seeing, children as young as 9 months being branded as criminals, or young people who are named as terrorists simply because of the way data is associated around them and numbers are being crunched in order to basically place people into a digital Jim Crow in which they're not able to know the transparency of and be able to fight against. So in the wake of this mass, impugned surveillance state, I think the danger that we face as organizers is to, one, to give into dread, but two, to also fall into this narrative of normalization of surveillance. And I think that one of the things that was very critical that came out of our summit, and I hope will continue past this conversation, is this surveillance is not normal. This surveillance is against the Constitution. And moreover, if we want to talk about surveillance from a racial justice lens, we have to understand that the Bill of Rights is not the simple origin of where we have created a conversation around surveillance for our communities, but that the founding of the U.S. settler colonial state was founded on the surveillance and the policing of Black and brown bodies. So whether it's the slave patrol or blood quantum laws with indigenous peoples, or acts like around immigration like the Chinese Exclusion Act, is that our mobilization as people of color is critical to the end of surveillance, and that we must address the fact that this is as much a failure of policy as it is a technological problem, and that we, in order to build a real lasting democracy that does not have such an intrusion into our privacy rights, we need to organize, not just have digital self-defense. They're kind of part and parcel of the battle.
Yeah, if we could have someone else jump in here.
So I think I have a slightly different take on it, in the sense that from my perspective, surveillance is the normal state of affairs in America, particularly for African people, for people of African descent, but not just for them. That to be born a person in this country who was part of a marginalized community meant that you were always under surveillance. So from my point of view, what the threat itself is not new. What's new are the methods that are being used to exercise the threat. And that if you look throughout our history, surveillance has always been used against communities of color, but it's also been used against working class communities, against people who tried to organize, against women, against queer communities, against any group of people that were considered to be a threat to the power of the state. So to me, what's different about the era that we're in now is that there's no longer any pretense that the power and the police powers of the state are not going to be used in service of the extraction of resources and the suppression of people who are attempting to hold on to the little bit of meager resources that they have. And from my point of view, it's really important for us to understand that, and to understand that, we're dealing with a president and an administration that are masters at manipulation, at deflection, distraction, denial, distortion, and ultimately destruction. And so that they will use a lot of the things that they do is designed to keep us distracted from what's really going on. My view of dealing with the GOP and Trump is that everything that they say about other people is actually revealing what they're doing, what their plans are. So if they say that they're promoting public safety, they're really about to engage in an assault on public safety. If they say that they're going to protect the environment, they're really getting ready to engage in an assault on the environment. So I've come to see them as a mirror that's reflecting all of the negative things that have been in America for a long time. And in terms of the immediate threat, I looked at the executive orders, and the one that really kind of disturbed me the most in the area of surveillance was the one that had to do with policing and public safety, where they linked together the three major threats being drug trafficking, violent crime, and illegal immigration. Now, first of all, to put illegal immigration in the same context as violent crime and drug trafficking means that we've upped the status on how we view just the status of not being documented. It's now considered to be, quote unquote, a serious threat to the country, a public safety threat, a felony that deserves all kinds of public safety resources. And the fact that it's being linked to drug trafficking and violent crime tells me that Trump is serious about his promise to be a law and order president. And in the same way that we saw Nixon in the 60s and Reagan in the 80s use the banner of law and order as a way to promote policies that were about targeting all kinds of marginalized people and people that they decided would throw away and would be better off to incarcerate, we're going to see more of that. The fact that the stock for private prisons went up right after the election is something that we need to pay attention to. So those are the things that have been both disturbing me, keeping me up at night, and having me think about ways for us to combat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to echo the concerns of the prior speakers. I very much agree with what they've been saying, and I think that one of the things that I've been turned on to in the past few weeks is really how fast the mission creep is happening between different agencies and in the government, and how quickly they're formulating a way to do all of this stuff at once, right? A lot of times in our public discourse, it's one issue, single issue politics that moves incrementally, but right now they're obviously working with a kind of shock doctrine type of, way of it inundating the public with so many concerns at once that it's hard for movements to pick what's important and how to focus and how to get organized. And so I see some of the more flash activism type organizing as something that's incredibly powerful. It shows solidarity, especially right after the Muslim ban, and then we're facing a kind of part 2 of that, and we're going to see how that plays out in the courts. And I see that, and I'm sure Alvaro can speak a lot to how important lawyers are going to become across this next moment. And we know even from the civil rights movement that lawyers became an instrumental force. But at the same time, I think even though we've had movements that are counter the state, we've always relied on the state as the last bastion of regulation and protection. And I think in this moment, we're feeling very unhinged because we can't depend on the state to protect from corporations. And we see this massive collusion between the state and these social media companies that in 2008, 2009, especially in 2011, were heralded as the platform of the people, right? And that these technologies would be the thing that would help us connect with one another and would liberate us together, right? It would give us a web in which we could speak to one another. And now we're seeing silos happening. We're seeing the, Twitter is essentially repurposed for geopolitics, right? I mean, before, the private conversations between heads of state were things that we weren't privy to unless reporters had unearthed them. Now they're happening in open forums, especially on Twitter, and in very small bits. And so we're left to guess what a lot of these things mean for us. And so I'm struggling with trying to understand that lineage of technology and technological change, that something that held for many of us a lot of promise early on is now becoming something that can track us, can contain us, can bring us into these dragnets and into these webs that are extremely problematic in terms of figuring out who's identifiable, and especially for movement's sake, people that are good at organizing are usually very charismatic, and they also have a story that we lean on as movement participants. We trust them, and we think about the trials that they've had to go through. And so I'm thinking here in particular about Dreamers, who are now have tweeted that they're undocumented and unafraid. That entire stash of hashtags becomes something that white nationalists have organized around to try to attack these students. And so the things that we've used to get in touch with one another are now becoming the foils in the props of these government and corporations, as well as these other counter social movements that we must be concerned about. I check.
Yeah, Alvaro, if I could, I want to get you to start off with our second question here.
Yeah.
I just want to remind folks if we could be brief in our responses so that we can allow everyone to sort of lend their expertise where they can. But our second question here is, what exactly are the communities here that are impacted by these narratives and by these technologies?
Yeah. So I think Deborah hit it on the head. There is a deep, deep history of a disparate impact of surveillance on, be it African Americans, immigrants, LGBT people, anyone who can be described as other, right, as not being part of a power structure. And to tie it to the previous question for a moment, I think there's a really damaging idea here in Washington that everyone is watched, when that's kind of half right. Everyone is watched, but not everyone is watched equally. And instead, what you've seen is that these really invasive technologies are basically beta tested on African American communities, immigrant communities, low-income communities, LGBT people. Few examples, in stingrays in Baltimore, we've seen data come out that stingrays are disproportionately used in African American neighborhoods. The 215 call records program the NSA eventually deployed on everybody was modeled off of a Drug Enforcement Administration program that was first effectively beta tested on immigrants calling home to their families in Latin America and elsewhere. There's been a lot of attention, recently on the disproportionate impact of surveillance on African Americans. What I think we're slowly waking up to is a disproportionate impact on immigrants. And the unfortunate fact is that immigrants are some of the most tracked people out there, particularly those that enter the country with inspection, right? So they entered in on a flight. This doesn't include folks across the border. If you're an immigrant who entered this way, most Americans don't have their fingerprints on file at the FBI. Most Americans, a little over half of Americans are in a face recognition database, but every single immigrant is in such a database, and every single immigrant who entered with inspection is in a fingerprint database. And I think folks on this call and this webinar probably know it, but I think a lot of folks don't realize that, Donald Trump isn't going to get 3 million people to volunteer themselves for deportation. He has to find them. And he has at his fingertips the greatest surveillance apparatus that this country has ever known. So I am really worried right now about what's going to happen in terms of surveillance of immigrants, but also what's going to happen to their data. And it extends beyond the Dreamer database, the DACA database. This extends to the databases of people who came in as unaccompanied minors, and the Obama administration would say, no, call your mom, call your dad, get them to pick you up. But now those moms' names, those dads' names are sitting in a database at HHS that, due to changes that this administration has recently made, can be shared much more easily with ICE, or rather without a paper trail. So this is, I think, the community that right now we need to redouble our attention to and trying to protect.
Yeah. Seymour, you work very closely with Muslim and South Asian communities. Do you want to add something here?
Yeah, I mean, I not only want to kind of echo what Alvaro talked about, but also just mention the psychological impact of how that extension of surveillance goes beyond the border, goes and really, has extended often into our areas of worship. And so, for example, we've been doing digital security training workshops with Muslim communities around the country. And, our initial deployment was going to be in mosques. But however, when we tried to do digital security trainings in mosques, we found that many communities believed that their mosques were already bugged. And so we had to find like offsite locations in order to be able to keep people safe and address the level of reasonable paranoia people have, that all of the community engagements in their neighborhoods are places and sites where they may be facing physical infiltration, as well as other forms of digital surveillance that we talk about. But I also think the other piece that we want to connect this to is that we are also reaching a new status of Jim Crow in relationship to sanctuary laws and the uneven application of sanctuary across the country. So in some places, take for example in New York and New Jersey, if New York is a sanctuary state and New Jersey has a governor that's not in support of sanctuary, then just the distance of driving an hour means a distance of whether or not you're going to have local law enforcement cooperate with federal officers in relationship to your immigration status and stops that may have related to that. So I think that what we're seeing is a combination of the digital with the failure of the legal processes to protect our rights, and also the narrative of terrorism and drugs and criminalization of Black and brown communities, leading to a perfect storm to the invasion around our rights to privacy, and therefore the need for us to organize around this issue.
Hey, Brandon. So the thing that I really want to say is that I've been a drug policy reform advocate now for about 20 years. And I think one of the things that people don't realize is that all of the things, the techniques and practices that we're talking about today are things that have become standard practice in fighting the war on drugs. And to the extent that we have accepted as a society the erosion of basic privacy rights, the allowance of laws that allow the prosecution of parents and family members as co-conspirators just for not being willing to tell on their other family member who may or may not be involved with drugs, the belief that some small amount of something is justified to giving people years and years of time in state and federal prison. It's like this, what I see happening is the expansion of a system that we've put in place, 10, 15, 20 years ago to deal with things like drug trafficking and other things that the public was basically not in approval of, is now being expanded to include all kinds of other things, including immigration status and, quite frankly, poverty, the criminalization of poverty. And so there are two things that happened this week that really worry me. One is the announcement of the threat of withdrawal and withholding of federal funds from cities that have declared themselves sanctuary cities if they refuse to go along with local law enforcement. And the thing to me that was missing in the reporting about that is that the money that goes to fund immigration goes through the Department of Homeland Security. The Attorney General is over the Department of Justice, which is a different department, which is a different stream of money. So the idea that they're threatening to withhold federal money from the Justice Department for people who refuse to go along with, for cities that refuse to go along with Homeland Security, to me is really problematic, number one. Number two, the fact that you're also at the same time considering legislation that would encourage and allow internet providers to be able to collect and sell the information about their subscribers' browsing habits is something that we should all think about. Because whether it's something as small as ordering marijuana online, as to something as big as finding out about how to get around your status if you're not undocumented, that information will first be collected for the purposes of profit, but then eventually will find its way into the government's hands. And the fact that that whole thing is getting so little attention, that the public does not recognize the long-term consequences of that for all of us, but especially for vulnerable populations, is something that I have alarm about.
Yeah. So we're going to have one more poll for our viewers at home before we have Joan, if I can, start us off with our third question. But that poll is, how secure are your digital communications? So we'll allow you all to respond at home. And our third question here is, What can we as everyday people do to defend ourselves, both in terms of personal security and in terms of movement struggles and demands? What are some of the things? Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you can hear me good. Okay. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. So as part of an organizing group that I work with at UCLA called the Undercommons, we recently held a security know your rights training with some people from the ACLU and other privacy rights technologists. And one of the things that's important is to know your tools, right? So you have the ability to send encrypted text messages through Signal if you do download and learn how to use the tool. And so being aware of what tools are available and who makes those tools is really important, I think, because again, encryption is a way to build a barrier between what your ISP is going to know or what your telephone company is going to know and what the message that you're actually sending. Encryption is going to put your message in a little envelope and send it. Doesn't mean the envelope can't get opened, but it looks a lot less like a postcard. So SMS texts without encryption look a lot like a postcard. They can be opened and read very easily. And so it's not a guaranteed way to communicate that won't be surveilled, but it makes it a lot harder. And I think that that's part of what we need to think about as organizers and as movement people, is it makes it a lot harder. But also I want to challenge people to convince everyone they know to use technologies that are considered more safe than others or more secure than others, especially because we can think about this as a vaccine model. The more people who use it, the better protected the entire community is going to be. And so if the more people we have, the harder it is to sort through things. And so, I hate to be the academic that's like, let's do a public health model of surveillance, but I think it's actually really a way that we can think about, well, how do we protect the community from broad, sweeping technologies or viruses that we don't want to infect everyone, and we want to protect the broadest possible community. And then as well, I think it's also important that we quarantine or stop using the things that make communication easy, but also make it easier for us to be surveilled. And this might mean abandoning technologies that we like in favor of technologies that work for us. And we're going to have to see how that pans out with the ISP ban, with the ISP ban, it's not a ban, with the ISP new regulations where they can sell your browser history. It might be imperative that we start to think about, well, what is the onion router? How do we move our information around online more securely, as well as how to stop using those websites that aren't going to traffic our information in an encrypted way. And so those are the things that I think are important right now, but also that I want to raise up the work of people that are doing these digital security trainings and encourage people to attend them, as well as to look at what's been posted on the EFF website, the Electronic Frontier website, Frontier Foundation website.
Yeah. So Alvaro, in your work at Georgetown, what sort of policy changes are you working toward?
Yeah, what we've been focused on is actually face recognition technology. And what people need to know with respect to this technology is, historically police, when they've wanted to identify someone, they had to approach them, they had to talk to them, they had to ask them for ID. Face recognition lets them do this from far away and in secret. And that's something that you can't even say about latent fingerprint analysis or latent DNA analysis. And you might be able to do it with your Stingray, but with face recognition, the cell phone is your face. So this is a really invasive technology, and there's not a single state that actually has passed a law to regulate it. Neither has Congress. So what we're proposing is a law that restricts how this technology is used, make sure it's not used on protesters, make sure it's not biased. There's actually been a problem with bias. Research has shown the technology actually underperforms and is less accurate for African Americans, women, and young people. The research that's out there has shown that more research needs to be done. And so we're proposing a set of reforms to fix these things and to basically put this technology under control. And you can see that website, by the way, with all the, those ideas and proposals at www.perpetuallineup.org. It's perpetuallineup.org.
Yeah. Deborah or Maury?
So I'm from New York. I live in California right now, but I'm from New York City. And the thing that really comes up for me in this conversation is that, you know, when I lived in Brooklyn, the NYPD had installed these large surveillance apparatus in our community more than a decade ago. These towers that you would find in any poor community in New York City that were basically 24-hour surveillance tools. And I mention that because to me, there's a failure of people to actually see that all of these various tools are first used against communities of color. So it's important to actually pay attention to what's going on in those communities if you want to have a sense of what's happening and what's going to come to the rest of the country. So I want to just highlight a couple of things in relationship to that. And these are less technological tools than they are people tools. I'm really concerned about the ways in which conspiracy laws have been used in the past and the ability for the government to be able to use them moving forward. We already have a set of laws that targets family members and others as co-conspirators for quote unquote drug crimes. I could see that being extended to crimes around immigration, etc., where people are faced with long sentences unless they're willing to cooperate with the police and prosecutors. That's already existing in our laws. It's very easy to extend them. That's something I really pay attention to, and there's more and more money being given to law enforcement apparatus to use those kind of laws to go after people. The second thing, which that also relates to, is the whole money issue. So much of modern policing is what I call legal looting, where they're actually sent into communities to find people engaged in minor crimes as a way of deriving income that pays their salaries and provides money to their cities. And again, inside of expanding the surveillance state, this kind of activity of traffic stops, of fines for open containers, for not mowing your lawn, all kinds of nonsense that we know is happening all over, can lead to people ending up in detention facilities, being deported, being separated from their family members. And this is not just a problem in border towns. They've been empowered to do this all over the country. And the third and final thing that I want to say is that throughout the history in this country, the major weakness that people have faced with respect to surveillance has been in their personal relationships. It's always been the government's tool to use people's personal relationships to implant folks close to them who will then be used against them, whether it's holding trumped up charges over them or deliberately putting people to infiltrate their organizations. But to me, that means it's really important for us to pay as much attention to developing trust amongst ourselves, to having close relationships, to nurturing those relationships, to protecting each other and letting each other know that we have each other's back. Because if we don't do that, they will always find a way to use those relationships against us.
Yeah. Then Maury, if you want to offer a last word briefly.
Sure. I mean, I just really want to encourage people that, you know, some of the best things that we can do to defend ourselves in terms of personal security is really understand that we are not, as individuals, going to be able to protect ourselves. This is not a time for individual self-defense. This is a time for community self-defense. And in that model, one, we have to center ourselves, our bodies, and our spirits, and acknowledge the trauma of this time and do things to maintain our self-care practice and collective self-care practice as we vision and imagine ourselves past this moment. But two, you know, building off of what both Deborah and Joan spoke about, that really, you know, in many ways, we have to be able to address this violation of our privacy by protecting ourselves in this mass way. So whether that's going to a digital security workshop, and I actually recommend going to many, because the process of digital security is iterative, and also to ask a lot of questions, to educate yourself at this time. You know, for many circumvention tools and the process around them in relationship to both the legal aspects and the technological protocols, it's just confusing. So, you know, for many people, it takes 1, 2, even 3 workshops to be able to create a healthy digital security culture for themselves and their organizations. But also, you want to question people that put yourself at risk. And this can include other collaborators that don't understand the risk of your community. It can also include foundations, because oftentimes many foundations have insecure data practices where you're revealing your strategy, the places you organize, the people in your community that might be undocumented or are in process with the state. And only you will be able to understand your threat model and the risks that you're taking to do your organizing. So you should be able to create the control and parameters around that. But most importantly, this is not a problem that is simply going to be solved by circumvention technology. This is a problem that's going to be solved by organizing. And so this webinar, that summit that we're a part of, the people are going to shift the conversation around surveillance, and all of us represent strategies. And I believe the people on the webinar are also other folks that are going to hold the pieces of how we're going to hold the state accountable. And so I look forward to this like developing racial justice movement against surveillance, because we are larger than the state and we will ultimately win.
Yeah, thanks to the 4 of you for that insight. And with that, I'm going to pivot to Anika, who's going to reveal the results of our last poll and take it from here.
Hello again, everyone. And again, thank you so much to all of our presenters for that amazing conversation. So earlier you all asked the question, how secure are you in your digital communications? And it looks like from this poll, the majority of you all are pretty secure and you are using Signal. The next group is somewhat secure, and there's some things you don't post online. Followed up shortly by I try to be thoughtful, does a password on a phone count. So thank you also for participating in that poll. And as Joan mentioned, there are a couple different apps out there like Signal that you all have said that you're using that will help you send secure communications. And I also just want to shout out Equality Labs. They have a series of fact sheets at equalitylabs.org. So feel free to please take a look at those and make sure that we are also being secure in our digital communications. So at this time, we're going to open up the floor for folks who have volunteered to give a public testimony. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit low on time, so we only have space for 2 folks. But please continue this conversation on Twitter with the hashtag surveillance. And so for the section, we have a couple different grounding rules. And we're asking first that everyone be impeccable with your words. We only have about a minute to share, so make sure that we're definitely keeping within that time limit. And please make sure that everything is grounded in your own experience. As we all know, we're masters of our own experience and our words are powerful. And while there are so many issues at hand, we also ask that you please stay on topic. So how this is going to work, I'm going to announce your name, your mic will be unmuted, and then I will come back and I'll announce the next name. So please, Sue Udry, we are here for your public testimony.
Hi, thanks a lot. So I just appreciate so much being on this webinar and hearing from you all. It's incredible. I think the point that I just wanted to raise up is kind of following on what Joan was saying, is that not all surveillance is new or high technology. And one of the surveillance programs that we're most concerned about is the Countering Violent Extremism program that was started actually under the Obama administration to ferret out mostly young people who they deem to be at risk or vulnerable for terrorist recruitment based on no empirical evidence, but certainly based on profiling, i.e. Muslims. So this is a program run out of the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, particularly the FBI and Attorney General. So I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to say that there are pilot programs of this Countering Violent Extremism program across the country, and we're working to oppose that in both Montgomery County, Maryland, Boston, Massachusetts, Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, and also in Los Angeles, California. And I guess I'm going to end it there to not take up too much time. But thanks a lot, Anika.
Thank you so much, Sue. Blair Beekman, you're up next.
Probably muted.
Okay, it looks like Blair is no longer with us. Blair, if you are, please feel free to write in your public testimony in the question section, and we will all be able to view it on the portal. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen, who's going to close us out in the next 10 minutes. Thank you all.
All right, I'm going to hop back on video as soon as Anika is out. Perfect. So turning this over to our presenters now. I want to close this out with a round of next steps from you all. And for the sake of time, I think I'd love to kind of condense it down to a sentence or two, like how can people stay connected to your work? This might be sending them to your website. This might be an event that you've got coming up. How can people stay connected to this conversation, to this work from your respective organizations? And we can start with Deborah, and then we'll go on down.
Well, the main thing, I think the main thing that I want to suggest to people is that they actually pay attention to the way in which money is flowing into their communities. I'm really concerned that one of the ways in which the Trump administration is going to try to separate people is by hiring folks to be part of this growing law enforcement apparatus as enforcement agents and ICE agents and TSA agents and all of that. So whether they plan to or not, they unwittingly become tools of this space. I think it's really important for us in the upcoming budget negotiations to really resist having funding for these kinds of things, because it's really hard once the money is there to get it back.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Joan, how about you?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the public testimony, and then the countering violent extremism move under Trump to focus on Islam is really problematic, because that program has been really important for a lot of us to identify white supremacist movements. And so a lot of the national focus on is being shifted away from looking at white nationalists or white supremacist movements and radical militia movements towards this end. And so it's not just that this program is refocusing, it's also diverting resources away from things that are the part of the base of the Trump movement. And so with Trump, it's very important that we pay attention to how white nationalism is being manifested in his policies. And so in our research lab, we've written a little bit about this, and I will add to my Twitter account how we view his 100-day plan. It's panning out the way we thought it would. We wrote it a couple of months ago, but this addition of Sessions is particularly problematic because Sessions came out, in the midst of the Russian, fiasco that we're facing. Sessions came out and low-key said, the Department of Justice is no longer going to be looking at local police departments and investigating them. And that was a really important way in which we raised the profile of what was going on in Ferguson as well as in Baltimore. And so these the shifts that we're watching are important for us to understand how they are shifts in policing, and they're also shifts in who is being policed. And so we need to pay a lot of attention to that. And so in addition to putting on my Twitter account that document, I also want to just say that I think that in Los Angeles in particular, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition is doing excellent and path-breaking work related to understanding how new technologies and new surveillance technologies are going to be borrowed and brought into communities. And so I'd really like for people to pay attention to what they're doing, as well as think about how we can run a defense through our local communities and through our local governments in order to at least stall, if not stop, some of this this national focus from spreading. Check.
Awesome. Let's pass it to Alvaro. How can people stay connected to your work?
Hey folks, so this is a way to stay connected to the work of a lot of the folks on this call and find out more. And I'm going to actually ask that folks not put this on Twitter. This is only for the folks that are on the call, not public yet. But on June 22nd here at Georgetown Law, we're going to have the second Color of Surveillance conference, which is about, and the last one we had was on the disparate impact of government surveillance on the African American community. This one will focus on the immigrant community. Obviously, there's an intersection there, but we're thrilled. We have some fantastic speakers we'll be announcing in about a week and a half or so. But mark your calendars, June 22nd. There will be a live stream, but we have a large auditorium here, accommodates a couple hundred folks. So if you're nearby, we'd love to have you, and it'll be free to attend.
Awesome. And how about you, Maury? How can people stay connected to the work of Equality Labs?
Well, we want to encourage folks to come and join us on Twitter at Equality Labs, and also visit our website, equalitylabs.org. On our website, you can find our most up-to-date tip sheets, as well as a form for folks that might be under digital threat. And this will include people who feel like they might be under surveillance by the state, but also soft actors of the state and outright trolls. And I think that, you know, for many of the folks that we work with a lot of folks that are in the crosshairs of both organizations, and I think have a sense of dread when talking about this issue of surveillance. And I feel like in those platforms and also in these trainings, a lot of what we try to do is like help people say there is a way through this. And I think when we center our power, not paranoia, as LAPD Surveillance Coalition talks about, but also center the fact that we are going to make it through this, that we will. So we urge you to join us on both of those platforms and look forward to building a way out of this together.
Awesome. And not to leave our moderator out, Brandon, how can people stay connected to your writing?
To my writing, well, you can log on to motherjones.com. You can follow me on Twitter at MyBlackMind with 2 Ds. That's about it.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. I just wanted to recap some of the things that folks have mentioned here. One, to remind you that as soon as this webinar is over, you'll be receiving a copy of the We Are the Color of Freedom report, which again detailed that gathering that many folks have referenced that happened back in December. But if you are too anxious and want to read it now, there's a bit.ly URL that you can copy and paste into your web browser and check it out. Also want to highlight a few things that folks have mentioned. Perpetual Lineup, the report that Alvaro worked on at Georgetown Law that looks at face recognition technology. Please check that out. It's a wonderful kind of overview of how this technology works and where it's being used. Also want to shout out the fact sheets that Equality Labs has on their website, equalitylabs.org, a wonderful set of resources. And would definitely encourage folks to do some more digging into the history on the war on drugs. I think that was a great kind of reference point for us to be thinking about how surveillance today and the shift that we're making towards centering immigrants as the quote unquote problem and the focus of surveillance does have its roots in historical legacies here in the United States, the war on drugs being a good reference point for that. So thank you, Deborah, for providing that. And Joan, all your writing and research that you've been doing around white nationalism, folks can probably check some of that stuff out on your website, joandonovan.org. So definitely encourage folks to do that, as well as other resources that folks have mentioned. Electronic Frontier Foundation has a lot of digital, security self-defense tools. So feel free to check them out as well. And lastly, just want to thank all of our speakers. Really appreciate, I'm sure if we had everyone off of mute, you'd be hearing a chorus of claps and sounds and hurrahs. And then to close us out, to just keep in touch with Color of Change and Center for Media Justice, your co-hosts for this webinar today. There's our Twitter handles. Please follow us.